Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am going to be talking about the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, or the Wolf Hall trilogy, depending on what your preference is. I think the two names kind of get battered around quite a bit. I really love this series, so I wanted to have a little chat about it, and by a little chat I mean that I have partially scripted a good chunk of this video because I really want to do these books justice and I don't want to lose my train of thought. So this might be a long video, bear with me, we're gonna have a lot of fun. This video is technically going to have spoilers for the Thomas Cromwell trilogy. However, since these books are entirely based on historical events, I'm assuming that most people are going into this series knowing how it ends. So hopefully that's all right for you. So to overview what these books cover, these books chronicle the life of Thomas Cromwell, who was born in 1485 in Putney, which nowadays is considered to be a fairly fancy part of London, but in the 15th, 16th century, it really wasn't. He was born in a lower class background to a blacksmith, but over the course of his life rose in prominence in the Tudor court. He left his home quite early on and became a mercenary fighting in France, became part of the household for a Florentine banker, learned languages in the Low Countries before eventually returning back to England and becoming an advisor to Cardinal Wolsey, and then eventually rising to become Henry VIII's chief minister and a lord. Now, this did not come easily or without making any enemies. Cromwell participated in both aiding the rise and the fall of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. He was a massive orchestrator of the dissolution of the monasteries, a big supporter of the Protestant Reformation, and was trying to do so with the aid of a king whose religious convictions tended to fluctuate depending on his immediate desires and his conscience. A lot of people have this idea that Henry VIII was actually a big Protestant, but actually his beliefs tended to sway much more towards Catholicism. He just did not want to be dictated to by the papacy, and he actually grew to be quite uncomfortable with the Protestant leanings of all of the people around him. Finally, after Cromwell found himself unable to get Henry out of his very much unwanted marriage to his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, the enemies around Cromwell decided to take the incentive to pounce on him, to take advantage of the king's bad mood, and also to plant their choice of bride, Catherine Howard, in Anne of Cleves's place. Cromwell was eventually imprisoned on charges of treason and was executed in 1540, and this was something that Henry VIII would later come to regret. Thomas Cromwell has traditionally always been portrayed as being a bit of a Machiavellian type of figure, a bit of a villain, especially for those who are more sympathetic to the Boleyn faction. And this was definitely the viewpoint that I came to the series with myself. And instead of that traditional villainous narrative, Hilary Mantel really plays into the rags to riches narrative with Cromwell. His lowly beginnings are constantly referenced throughout all three books, and she uses it to build a great amount of sympathy for him. His family and life are also given a fair amount of page coverage, and you see him as both a politician and as a family man. You also see how the people around him are inspired and in awe of him and really have a deep loyalty to him, which then makes his subsequent fall feel really devastating regardless of how you initially reacted to Cromwell and how you initially saw him as a person. I half seriously, half jokingly made a comment to one of my friends about the fact that it seems in the Wolf Hall books that Thomas Cromwell is repeatedly propositioned by prominent women. It seems like every prominent woman in the Tudor court seems to fall in love with him and want to have sex with him. And I thought maybe Hilary Mantel is going a little bit too far in trying to make Cromwell irresistible. And my friend made actually a really good point that maybe it's not that she's trying to say that everybody loved Thomas Cromwell, but actually that people perceived him as being more susceptible to these sexual offers because of his lower class background. That people were trying to catch him out because of their perception of him. Because of course in this time period your low class background and your sexual history is somehow indicative of your morality. Gosh, I'm so glad it's not like that now. The books themselves are split up thus. Wolf Hall largely covers the beginning of Cromwell's life up until 1535, though it largely covers a 5 to 10 year period, and it ends with the death and execution of Thomas More. Bring Up the Bodies then completely changes pace, and it takes place in a period of just 1 year between 1535 and 1536, and it ends with the execution of Anne Boleyn. And then The Mirror and the Light goes from 1536 to 1540 and of course ends with the death and execution of Thomas Cromwell himself. What I found really, really interesting with these books is that despite the fact that there was quite a big gap in publication, particularly between the second and the third, that the narration was actually quite consistent. I never felt like Hilary Mantel lost sight of the story that she was trying to tell or Cromwell's voice within the entire series. If anything, I would say that there is a little bit of a pace change between Wolf Hall and the later books, because those later books are covering a fewer amount of years, but covering a much larger page count. I would also say that The Mirror and the Light is much more reflective and philosophical, and it was actually my favourite book of the series because of that. There are these really beautiful passages where Cromwell will just be reflecting on the nature of his life and his position in the court, his rise and his eventual fall, and I just found them so stunning. These passages never feel like a weight down on the story, they feel very, very natural and almost like a warning of what we know is going to come. It's almost like Cromwell in the earlier books spent so much time doing, so much time working, being very in the moment to get to his higher position, that it's just at this moment where he becomes slower and more reflective that he starts to lose his grip. My favourite passage in the entire trilogy comes in The Mirror and the Light, and it goes as follows. "A giant cannot imagine what it is like to be a man of ordinary height. He cannot enter into their feelings. He never learns to bargain or deceive. Why would he, when he gets his way simply by cracking his knuckles? When you are a child, you think you have to kill the giant, but as you grow up, you think different. Suppose you meet him by chance one day, you about your common business, picking up sticks or inspecting your rabbit traps, and he taking the air at the entrance to his cave, or toiling on a mountainside to uproot great oaks. Giants are lonely. They don't know any other giants. Sometimes they want a boy like Jack to amuse them, to run errands and to teach them songs. Conquer your awe then, grab your chance. If you know how to talk to a giant, it works like a spell. The monster becomes your creature. He thinks you serve him, but in fact, you serve yourself." I feel like there is so much tied up in that little passage. You see so much of Cromwell's worldview. His recognition of the mentality of kings and how lonely it is to be a king and to have no other peers around you. But you also see how Cromwell works this situation to his advantage, making the giant, or Henry, his creature. You also see in this passage a little glimmer of what is to come. There is always the risk that the giant, or Henry, will remember his strength and superiority and use it against Jack. And there is also the risk that maybe Jack isn't the only giant tamer. Maybe someone else will come to supplant Cromwell and be able to use his giant against him. I think the main reason that the Thomas Cromwell series has had such recognition is because these books are incredibly atmospheric. You really feel as if you've just been plopped right into 1520s, 1530s England. Hilary Mantel allows you to just live and breathe in this world. You can see their clothes, the smell on the street, you understand the rituals, the religious beliefs, and why. You can really, really tell that she did so much research into this series. These books are so detailed to the point that when I first started reading Wolf Hall, I was a little bit concerned that maybe people who are new to Tudor history might not initially get on with it. I love Tudor history, and one of the reasons I ended up getting into this book was because I loved that time period so much and I knew what was coming, I knew all the characters, but I wondered if all of this detail might be just as much of a hindrance as it is impressive, that maybe it's all a little bit too much, too fast, too soon. But from what I've gathered from asking other people about it, that isn't the case, and actually the fact that these books are so immersive means that people find themselves really focusing on the books. Maybe they have to take their reading pace a little bit slower, maybe they do have to do a little bit of Googling, but actually they really enjoy it and it's not a hindrance to their enjoyment. And I think that this immersive atmosphere that Hilary Mantel is trying to evoke is not just an attempt by a historical fiction writer to be like, look at me, look at me, look at all the research I did, look how clever I am, which I think is a trap that a lot of historical fiction writers can fall into. These rich, vivid descriptions of the Tudor period also help to illuminate a bit more of Thomas Cromwell's character and show him as being a very observant, very shrewd person. He recognises everything around him. As a result of all of this heavy, heavy description, you know that he is taking in everything around him and that he is going to use it for later purposes, and you can't help but be a little bit impressed with him. I just think it's really well done. So a little point that I wanted to bring up was something that initially actually pulled me away from the Thomas Cromwell series. I actually tried to read Wolf Hall back in November and found that I really couldn't get into it because of this one thing, and it is the depiction of Thomas More. For those of you who don't know, Thomas More was the Chancellor to Henry VIII between 1529 and 1532. He was a well-known humanist scholar, and you'll probably most recognise him from his work Utopia. You know that book that Drew Barrymore's character in Ever After is obsessed with and quotes from? Yeah, that book. If you suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners corrupted from infancy, and then punish them for those crimes to which their first education disposed them, what else is to be concluded, sire, but that you first make thieves and then punish them? Oh, I just love it so much. Thomas More was a long-time friend and mentor to Henry VIII. However, he was very critical of the Protestant Reformation and of Henry's breaking from the papacy. He ultimately ended up being tried and executed for refusing to sign the Oath of Supremacy, the oath which would confirm Henry VIII as being the supreme head of the Church of England. And this was despite the fact that everybody in his life was pleading with him, please Thomas, just sign it. He absolutely refused to do so. His conscience would not allow it. He was later regarded as a Catholic martyr and has since been canonised by the Catholic Church in 1935 and is now known today as the patron saint of statesmen and of politicians. However, Thomas More was not without his controversies. Something that historians still grapple with today is how involved he was in Protestant torture and executions during his chancellorship. It really ranges from some scholars thinking he had absolutely nothing to do with it, to John Fox in his Book of Martyrs saying, yeah, Thomas More totally personally tortured people at his own home. He almost certainly did approve of the execution of heretics though, but a lot of the evidence for it is a little bit squiffy. If you do want to read a little bit more about Thomas More's life, then I would really recommend reading Peter Ackroyd's biography of him, which includes one of my favourite chapter titles in any book ever. I'm going to link it here. And no, I'm not kidding, that is actually what one of the chapter titles is called. And what you find in Wolf Hall is that the negative aspects of Thomas More are really played up from those bigger controversies, such as whether or not he was involved in Protestant executions, to slightly smaller details, like the fact that he wore a hair shirt for a period of time, which is something I'm not going to go into now, but I'll probably link down below some details about it, because no, my brain capacity is not for that discussion today. And also the fact that he married his second wife within a month of his first wife dying. These things are really, really dwelt upon in this trilogy to the point where I found it almost comical. And this is even after Thomas More has died. Like, it's not just that in Wolf Hall these things are mentioned, it's mentioned in these other two books as well. What's probably worth saying here is that Thomas More was actually the subject of my third year special subject at university. I spent an entire academic year learning about the life of Thomas More and seeing the Tudor court from his perspective. And I think because I spent so much time with Thomas More and seeing things from his worldview, I unknowingly developed a little bit of a loyalty to him, despite the fact that I knew that there were both good and bad sides to his personality and to what he did at his time as a chancellor. So to see a portrayal of him that just seemed so utterly one-dimensional just kind of rubbed me up the wrong way when I was reading Wolf Hall for the first time. And if Thomas More's involvement in torture and executions are really played up, then I would argue that Thomas Cromwell's role in the same thing was played down. There is a lot of historical debate over how far Thomas Cromwell used torture against his enemies. But the Cromwell in Mantel's novels may dangle the threat of torture, but he vehemently denies that he actually gave the order to do any of it. In the books, rumours of him torturing people does circulate, but he is insistent that if any torturing did occur, it was not at his command. When you compare the two characters, it's a big subversion from the traditional More-Cromwell depiction. Usually, More is portrayed as the hero, as the martyr, and Cromwell is depicted as the Machiavellian, conniving villain. And that subversion is deliberate. I realised that I was bringing a lot of my own preconceived notions of Thomas Cromwell and his character, you know, seeing him as the villain of the Tudor court, as the architect of Thomas More and Anne Boleyn's executions, who eventually got his just desserts. And I realised that that was not the way to approach this book and that I had to let those perceptions go. There are so many different ways in which Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell have similar interests and similar paths. They were both very intelligent, learned men who became lawyers, who eventually acted as Henry's right-hand man. But then there are other ways in which their paths completely subverted from each other. This book in particular acts as a bit of a redressing of the balance in the media portrayals of More and Cromwell, and I think they act as a good reminder to not just rely on one piece of media or one text to determine your opinion of a historical character, but to be consistently open to new perspectives and readdress your perceptions. What these books made me realise was the way in which the heroes and the villains in a story will greatly shift depending on the perspective, and that a narrator does not need to be 100% trustworthy to be interesting. And just generally a reminder that real people are not just wholly good and bad. There is a lot of moral greyness to be found, especially in the Tudor court where it seems like everyone's a Slytherin. I left this series wanting to know more about Thomas Cromwell, which was amazing because he wasn't a figure that I was ever particularly interested in. And I think this series has made me more open to seeing narratives from different points of view. For example, I think maybe the reason I was so receptive to reading The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was because I had read this first. So that is my little review of the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, and I hope that I have done these books justice. After going on that little bit of a mental journey with the first book, I really fell in love with them. And I think they've set in my head quite a high bar for historical fiction in the future. I would not be surprised at all if Hilary Mantel does have a hat trick and manages to get the Booker Prize this year. I think it'll have to be something quite spectacular to really knock her out of the running. I'll certainly be rooting for her, I think. So yeah, that is it for today. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this series. Have you read it? Are you a fan? Did you have any preconceptions about Thomas Cromwell when you first started reading this, or did you just instantly get it? I would really, really love to know. I hope that you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and wish me luck on editing this because this is going to be a long one. Thanks. Bye.